Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer Fantasy lore. Before we get started though, I'd like you to have a good look at this new background made by TechmagusKhobotov, linked to his DeviantArt in the description below. It is a really cool piece with a lot of hidden details in it, so you should definitely get a good, nice long look at it. I've also got another background for next week, but that one's a bit more clear, 40k, so I figured I'd save that up. Now then, let us move on to the subject of today's video, namely Runesmiths and, of course, their runes. Now, I did cover this kind of-ish in my dwarves video, but I figured they deserve a little bit of a special mention in their very own video, particularly considering how different their runic craft is to regular everyday magic in Warhammer Fantasy, because, make no mistakes, it is magic, except in a very different format. You could perhaps compare it to the operating systems of a PC. They're basically both trying to achieve much the same thing, allowing you to run your magical little computer and do all of the cool things that you can do on it. But on the same time, whilst the goal and the outcome might be more or less similar, what goes on beneath the hood could be very different indeed. Whilst regular everyday magic simply taps into the winds of magic, which is essentially a raw warp energy, and then channels that energy into the real world, the runic craft takes that energy and traps it within the material world, binding it to a certain set of conditions required for their activation. This is a much safer way of utilizing the power of the warp, but it is not quite as effective, shall we say, although that is not entirely correct either. How do I put this? Runic magic can be extremely effective and very destructive, but to create these far more powerful runes, a lot more work has to be put in it. To create a rune with the same destructive power as a just good old-fashioned fireball is going to require a hell of a lot more knowledge, a hell of a lot more training, a hell of a lot more material, and a hell of a lot more expertise, time, and resources than simply just tapping into the winds of Akshi and throwing a fireball at the enemy. In return for all of that effort, however, it is a much safer form of throwing a fireball at the enemy. Whilst tapping directly into the winds of magic, well, as we mentioned, that is basically you tapping directly into the warp. And when you're doing something like that, even if 99.9% of the time it all works out just fine, there's always that 0.1% that you will be turned into a seven-anused rat. You can never quite know with the winds of magic. They're somewhat unpredictable. But we are getting way ahead of ourselves. Before we really start talking about runes, and how they may or may not differ from usual magic, let's actually start talking about the people who wield them, the Runesmiths. They are one of the great guilds of the dwarven clans. One with considerable power, as they are the only ones within dwarven society that can utilize magic in any form whatsoever, although the way they use the runes is almost more technology than magic. Or, well, you know, if technology ran on magic, that is. They're also one of the oldest orders of all the guilds, supposedly learning their trade from the very ancestor gods themselves, who saw the winds of magic for the fickle, untrustworthy, filthy things that they really are, and decided to try and tame their energies within runes. Now, there has been a few willful rumours about the very early days, where dwarves supposedly utilized some form of magic, and we do know that dwarves are not utterly incapable of using magic, see the Chaos Dwarves for that, but it is far more difficult for them to use magic, and seeing as the warp is of course affected by the feelings, emotions, and convictions of everybody that is in touch with it, e.g. every single living being, if every single dwarf thinks that he can't wield magic, well, then dwarves can't wield magic. The fact that the Chaos Dwarves can, well, that just proves that they are a far more enlightened lot. Alternatively, it could have something to do with all of the blood sacrifices, but those are spurious and downright defamatory rumours about the noble Chaos Dwarves. Yes. Yes. Anywho, before I dig this hole any deeper, let's go back to the actual proper dwarfies. So, the Ancestor runes were considerably more powerful than anything they could create today, with a lot of the knowledge having been lost. Apparently, the Dwarven Runesmiths have some very interesting ideas when it comes to passing on their knowledge. We've seen this in a couple of various books, where a Master Runesmith will actually withhold knowledge from his apprentice if he doesn't feel that the apprentice has developed the correct levels of understanding and respect on his own. Dwarves are remarkably stubborn creatures, and if they had to be made to suffer through a particular trial or tribulation, you can bet your grandmother's beard on the fact that they are not going to be teaching anybody else that thing without forcing them to go through the exact same trials and tribulations that they had to go through. Of course, there is a small problem with this, namely that, once upon a time, their master knew why they put their young apprentices through those particular trials and tribulations, whilst the younger generations might simply put the even younger generation through it, well, out of sheer pure fucking spite, basically. To further reinforce the problem, dwarves, not being content with merely being stubborn, also tend to guard their secrets extraordinarily jealously, which means that even if they know that a certain rune will be completely lost with their death, that mere trifling fact alone is not good enough a reason for them to just tell somebody how something might function. Now, they do have a certain good reason for doing this, kind of, in that certain runes require a certain, shall we say, base understanding of the rune itself, a certain attitude and appreciation for the runes. Merely teaching someone the steps to create a rune might not necessarily translate into somebody being able to actually make that rune. It's a little bit fiddly, but even if somebody were to successfully complete correctly all of the steps required to make a rune, if he does not have the correct understanding and attitude towards the art of rune crafting, then that in and of itself will be enough for the rune crafting to fail. Again, bear in mind that this is of course a form of magic, which means that the feelings, the mental stability, the understanding, and the certainty, most of all, of the person trying to wield it is of paramount importance. If at any point during the forging process the runesmith doubts himself or thinks that this might not work, odds are it's not going to work. Add that fact to all the dwarves' tendency towards a somewhat, shall we say, pessimistic attitude, and, well, you've got yourself a little bit of a perfect storm there. Now, you might also be thinking, with the dwarves being all kinds of technological and stuff, they might be able to recreate these runes, or indeed create entirely new runes. Well, kind of, except just like the Guild of Engineers, where any kind of new technology will have to go through hundreds, if not thousands of years of testing before it will even be vaguely accepted, the same rules hold true for rune crafting, except they're even more anal about it. For a new rune to be created is, well, it's practically unthinkable. It hasn't been done for thousands of years, and for any runesmiths to even really consider the task of trying to create a new rune is, well, most runesmiths would simply just dismiss the idea out of hand as pure hubris, as them trying to recreate the arts of the ancestral gods, which would be the height of nonsense. And to a certain extent, they're not technically wrong either. The creation of a rune is extraordinarily difficult. It is a very, very, shall we say, finicky sort of thing. The rune requires the precisely correct temperature. It requires to be hit with a hammer the exact number of times. It requires to be turned the precise number of times. The rune itself needs to be carved with the precisely correct type of tool. The tool needs to be made out of exactly the same type of material. The material, hell, needs to be the exact kind of temperature. Hell, the material might even need specific runes on it, etc., etc., etc. In other words, if a fly so much as farts in the vicinity of a dwarf's workshop, it might all be for naught. And I am only half joking when I say that. Even the most experienced of runesmiths can occasionally fail to create a rune for no apparent reason. Or at the very least, they are unable to identify where they went wrong, so, there could be a little fly somewhere up in a corner perhaps, giggling quietly about its little piece of mischief, wasting God only knows how many hours and valuable resources because flies are douchebags. It's quite obvious, really. Now, all of this is, as you can probably tell, unfathomably complicated, to the point where actually doing this knowingly is actually kind of difficult. This is the kind of thing that is almost better done instinctually. And part of the training of a runesmith is allowing them to kind of tap into a spiritual connection, perhaps, I would say, with their runes and with their ancestor gods. As many runesmiths describe going into a kind of meditative trance whilst creating their runes. They will lose themselves in a form of a stupor, perhaps, where they will spend days eating and drinking very little and simply working on the runes, almost as if through pure instinct. This is in all due likelihood much like how certain mages, and indeed entire subclasses of magic users, often referred to as sorcerers, function. Basically, they might not have any academic understanding of the magic that they are using, but it kind of just flows through them. This is quite common in the Warhammer world, with relatively few races actually using, how should we say it, the science, quote-unquote, of magic. Orc magic users, for example, shamans, they just kind of let it flow out. Hell, they barely understand what's happening half of the time. The High Elves have a very rigorous and controlled system. The Empire has a slightly less, but still fairly rigorous system, based upon the High Elf system, in fact. The Dark Elves, kind of a mix of both. They do allow a lot of their passions, quote-unquote, to run loose, but they do also control it. Chaos Sorcerers? Well, it's basically a part of the job description that they let their magic get away with them. As for the Chaos Dwarves, they have figured out a rather interesting little kind of middle ground between runes and magic, in that they will often use tools to channel the magic, but they do not bind the magic, or, well, they do occasionally do that as well, but it's, relatively speaking, rarer, and it is usually done in far more, how do I describe this? Disturbing ways, shall we say, like, taking a bunch of dead people and binding their souls and still technically alive, and capable of feeling pain bodies, into a massive demon-fueled cannon that spits out warp material feeding on their souls. It is something I would hesitate to compare to runic crafting, but purely technically speaking, the two are not entirely dissimilar. And mind you, all of this complexity is only to create, well, relatively powerful runes, nothing that could even compare to the stuff that the ancestor gods eventually created, and hell, even their apprentices for thousands of years. The dwarves used to be able to create fully automated golems that could wander around and fight for them. In fact, they utilized entire armies of these things, and they still had quite a few right around the time that the High Elves and the dwarves got into their little spat, their little war. Granted, their numbers were lessening, but they still had quite a few, and these things were ludicrously powerful. They would be the Warhammer world's version of a goddamn titan, essentially. It can wander straight into entire demonic hordes and not really care that much. They also had several ways of easing the task of creating runes. For example, there is evidence to suggest that once upon a time they were able to mass produce lighting runes. Entire halls would have been lighted using these runes, essentially functioning as little electrical glow globes that would last for decades, if not even centuries, though in modern fantasy times, or hell, even not even modern, but all the way back to the Fall, the technology to create them and to repower them was starting to peter out. Now, the simple suggestion that at once upon a time they could fill entire dwarven halls with these things suggests that once they were pretty goddamn easy to produce, as a single hold would require tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of these damn things. This means that either A, there were a lot more runesmiths back in the day, B, they had figured out some way of mass producing them, or C, they had at least to some limited extent figured out how to automate the production. Now, we do know that A is true. Whether or not B is true, e.g. they had figured out some way of producing them in bulk, we don't know, although the sheer number of ancient runic artifacts would suggest that they probably had, and C, well, they had massive walking war golems, and there is at least one mention of something that would seem, or, well, sound, quote-unquote, to be some form of automated anvil. Now, the wording is extremely vague, but it seemed to suggest that there was some form of forging station that was capable of taking over a fair bit of the menial tasks of creating a rune. In other words, it would be able to prepare the metals, the materials, maybe even carve some of the lesser runes, and then the runesmith would only be needed to really pour the magic into the finished rune. Now, I will also mention that there is a potential fourth option, the D option. Namely that this took place over the course of tens of thousands of years, and there could simply just have been a lot of dwarves doing really, really boring light bulb shit for a very long time, and that's how they eventually produce enough of them. I mean, it's considerably less romantic than A, B, and C, but D does have its own charm, I suppose. Anyways, let's get back to the runes a little bit, because we are almost done talking about just the runes and the runesmith, and soon we'll talk about what they can actually do. But just before we get to that, I'd like to read to you an excerpt from one of the Dwarf Army books, giving you a little bit of an insight into, well, just how complicated this shit can be, because I really can't overstate the point. So, quoting, "Seek the mountain's heart, take it on the third moon's last day, stoke the furnace at midnight, when the ore glows red, hammer it before dawn, 7 times bend the white-hot metal upon itself, 7 times sing the forging song, quench it in dragon's blood, slake red-hot in Karak Ungol's quicksilver, do this in Haki the ancestor's name, temper in Van's water, hone the blade upon a dragon's horn, on winter's third moon, carve the slaying rune, anoint with blood of a troll slain on Grungni's day, bind the hilt with dragon's hide, with horn side inside, half the hilt with Asgal's gold, bind with azul metal, mark the orc's fang pommel with Grimnir's sign, make the naming rite with ale upon Velias' altar, the slaying of a troll by nightfall on that same day will make the rune glow for 1,000 years. That is to create a single rune of slaying. And remember, if you make even a single, minuscule mistake at any point during this process, that's it, you're done. It's not going to work. And you will have wasted all of those ridiculously valuable resources, not to mention the literal months necessary, and have nothing to show for it except a rather ugly rock. And again, that is for a single, simple rune. To create a really potent runic weapon, like for example the Runenfangs, that shit takes decades. And a single weapon can have up to 3 runes, or, well, technically it could have more, and some of the really old runic weapons is said to have up to several more slots, but with the current knowledge that the dwarves possess, a weapon can only have 3 runes before the weapon simply just implodes. And we are talking really super rare material weapons here. We're talking mithril, with lots and lots of additional enchantments placed upon it. And yet, some of the ancient weapons, including, potentially, Gal Maraz, the Emperor's Hammer, might have had as many as 4 or 5. To make that even more impressive, no weapon may have the same runic structure. Now, this is kind of a double-edged sword, kinda, because they can, but at the same time, very rarely. So, runesmiths are essentially extreme prima donnas. They consider themselves artists and oh so mega uber duper special that they don't ever want to create the same weapon twice. If they've created a weapon with a certain set of runes, you're gonna have to pay them a lot of money and whisper a lot of sweet nothings into their ears to even have them considering creating a weapon similar to that one. Hell, even asking a runesmith to do something that another runesmith has done before is going to require some pretty goddamn sincere persuasion. Now, luckily, before the runesmith becomes a full runesmith and he's still an apprentice, he has considerably less of an ego, and he might be able to get them to create several of the same type of items, essentially asking them to mass-produce something, although even then, the resources involved, the time, etc., and the fact that an apprentice will essentially be wasting his time creating the same item, since his master is undoubtedly going to be frowning upon that, yeah, even that's going to be requiring a certain degree of persuasion. Now, this appears to be more of a recent thing. The older runesmiths were clearly a fair bit more practical, as they were also willing to create large numbers of glowing light runes, as well as the golems, for example, which we know were produced in fairly large numbers at some point in time, meaning that at some point or another, a runesmith must have made more than one of the same kind of rune. And speaking of prima donnas, I think I deserve an ad. Now then, we've talked about how the runes are made and by whom. The rune priests, a very, very special order. Essentially, the only way you can become a rune priest is by having one teach you his secrets, and hopefully he'll teach you most of them. If not, well, too bad, I suppose. But what are the runes themselves? You can kind of think of them like circuit cards to a certain extent. The various materials used, the various crafting methods, and the various magic poured into it will all combine to determine the effect of the rune. If the rune is crafted successfully, then it will do that one thing, and only ever that one thing. If you created a light rune, it will always produce light. It'll never suddenly fire off a fireball or turn somebody into a frog or anything like that. It is a very, very stable sort of magic, but one that requires an absolute ton of effort to actually create. But that's not all. Certain runes require other runes to function, or at the very least to draw out their full potential. Let's compare that to, for example, a traffic light, where you've got several pieces of circuitry all carrying out their assigned function to actually create the effect of the traffic light. If it was just blinking randomly, well, things would get interesting real goddamn quickly. And the exact same thing would happen with runes. If you put 3 runes in a weapon and they don't really work with each other, well, best case scenario, the weapon will be simply destroyed in a little poof explosion. Worst case scenario, it'll take a solid chunk of the countryside along with it. Additionally, there are certain structures. As previously mentioned, weapons are really not supposed to be the same, which of course means that experimentation is paramount in what runes function with what other runes, but generally speaking, you will want one controlling rune if you want several runes on a weapon. If you only want one, then, there is nothing to control, but if you want 2 or even 3 runes, you are going to need a master rune. This rune will then determine the overall nature of the runic enchantment. It will be the controlling influence that keeps the other 2 in check, and you can never have more than one master rune, or, well, again, back in the olden days it was said that you could, maybe just maybe, have more than one, but generally speaking, these runes feed off the lesser runes, and if you've got two equally strong runes, both trying to feed off each other, well, that's basically a little bit of a stalemate war between the runes that will eventually end in, well, an explosion. A rather large one as well. Supposedly, there was once upon a time a rune specifically designed to calm the competitive instincts of the smaller runes, therefore allowing more runes to be placed upon a weapon. I believe I read somewhere, though pinch the salt on this one because I can't remember exactly where, that there were two master runes in the golems, which essentially function as the heart and the soul of the creature, giving it artificial life, and they required an intermediary rune to, well, mediate between these two and ensure that the golem didn't go bang. Then again, if you ask me, that sounds like a missed opportunity. You could have literal armies of Allahu Snackbar robots. That'd be pretty effective. Expensive, but effective. Now, let's get a little bit deeper into exactly what runes can do. So, there are far too many runes for me to list, but there are some general categories, shall we say. We have weapon runes, armor runes, talisman runes, banner runes, engineering runes, talisman runes, and anvil runes. Now, these last ones, anvil runes, are a little bit special. Whilst the other ones are placed into weapons, armor, banners, talismans, etc., and give specific functions, usually pertaining to warfare, or some form of protection, there are also a lesser, although not truly runic, craft, where you can inscribe runes on, for example, a house. Now, this isn't true rune crafting, but it does have superstitial value. And in a world where believing in something hard enough makes it real, well, it's not entirely unreasonable to call that rune crafting as well, although, well, it's not technically rune crafting, but I thought I'd mention it. Anyways, back to the anvil runes. So, these are runes inscribed upon an anvil, often an anvil of doom, which is basically an artillery weapon, or, in some cases, an anvil with more, well, practical effects. Now, the Anvil of Doom has several runes which can be struck upon it to create certain effects. It might bolster the courage of nearby dwarves, it might blast apart enemies, hell, it might even deform the very landscape itself. Whilst in other cases, you might have a special runic anvil that could potentially be used as an Anvil of Doom, ergo an artillery piece on the battlefield, but it could also be used to help with the creation of new runes. Indeed, some very ancient, almost mythical runes would require such an anvil as part of the creation process. Unfortunately, the dwarves have long since lost the knowledge required to actually create new anvils with these special runes, so the loss of every single anvil is a very, very big deal indeed. Additionally, all runes leak magic extraordinarily slowly if you've done it properly, but they do leak magic and eventually lose their potency, except for the absolute most powerful of runes, which some exist even since the days of the ancestors, which prove that either they lose magic unbelievably slowly to the point where even 10,000 years isn't really that big of a problem, or they simply don't lose magic at all, or possibly even they replenish their magic gradually over time. Although even then, it is not certain that they will last forever. You see, another reason why a lot of the ancient knowledge has been lost is, well, partially due to the prima donna-ness of the Runesmiths, but also because the prerequisitions for creating some of these runes simply do not exist anymore. Back in the olden days, the flow of magic into the world was controlled and directed through the polar gates. This meant that there was far more magic in the world, and the magic that was in the world was controlled. It was a pure and distilled form of magic, not the raw power of the warp. As that magic becomes ever lessened in the world and gets to an even greater degree day by day, although extraordinarily slowly, replaced by more chaotic forms of magic, it becomes harder and harder to create certain runes. Basically, runes can, to a certain degree, control and corral even the wildest of magic, but certain runes are too delicate and too powerful to be created with such an unstable energy source. Again, you remember the whole list I gave you? You can imagine that if a stable and pure form of energy is required as one of the stepping stones, then yeah, if that source is even rarer and only located in a very few areas, like for example, as it started with, the heart of a mountain, then it gets a hell of a lot more difficult to create those runes. Now, as I said, there are far too many runes for me to really list, but I can give you some examples of what runes might do. For example, Rune of Breaking. This is a rather specific one designed for, well, very specific circumstances. It was first invented during the Great War of Vengeance, where the dwarves fought the High Elves. The High Elves were also very, very fond of magic equipment, and in many cases their magic equipment was just as good as the dwarves, maybe, in some cases, even superior. Now, during that time, entire armies were equipped with magical weapons and equipment, which meant that having a Master Rune of Breaking, an enchantment capable of destroying other enchantments, was extraordinarily fucking useful. Now, as I mentioned, this was invented during the War of Vengeance. Precisely how long it took to invent it, we don't know, but decades at the very least. As inventing new runes is extraordinarily difficult considering the sheer complexity of it, and inventing a rune with the specific kind of effect you want it to have, oh, now that is even more ridiculous, because then you're going to have to start looking into, okay, which of the 1,000,000,001 steps in creating this rune has what effect? Basically, what does binding the hilt in dragon leather do? What precisely is the effect of that action? Will binding it with the scales outside create a different kind of rune? Or simply stop it from working altogether? And then you're going to have to do that reverse engineering for basically every single goddamn step, so yeah, difficult. And hell, I know I'm wandering a little bit off topic here because I was talking about the rune specifically, but even reverse engineering a rune can be hilariously hard. Now, each rune and the weapon or armor or banner, etc., that is placed upon will give some hints as to its creation process, and very, very good runesmiths might even be able to read a certain amount of the information they need to try and recreate the rune from its magical aura, from the feel of it, from the curves in the runes, from the depth of the chisel strokes, etc. A million minor details, but even then, even if you have 99 out of the 100 steps required, you're still then going to have to try and guess what the fuck the 100th step could be. And remember, it could be pretty much anything. It could be something ridiculous, like cooling the blade in the tears of a virgin high elf, or it could be something absolutely ridiculously mundane, like singing a goddamn song X number of times. Anyways, returning to the examples. Another one would be a very specific one, like a rune of dragon slaying, which I think you can guess the purpose of this one, or troll slaying, or, beast slaying in general, demon slaying, stuff like that. Very, very specific purposes. You might also have a rune with a very general purpose, like for example a rune of might, which simply makes the dude, well, mightier. Or another very broad and generalized effect, fear. Now obviously, things are afraid of different things. What scares a soft, squishy little human is probably not going to have a whole lot of an effect upon a beast man. And so a rune of fear would either have to basically read the mind of its target, or be able to manipulate any and all living creatures' biologies, with a few exceptions, in such a specific fashion as to create the feeling of fear. Hell, it can also give the dwarves carrying a specific runic banner a feeling of courage, which will essentially be a form of mental manipulation. I wonder if the dwarves ever thought of it that way. And mind you, not all runes need to be directly beneficial. They can do, well, practically anything as long as you can figure out the recipe. For example, engineers occasionally use a master rune of immolation when they place it on particularly valuable pieces of artillery or workmanship which they cannot afford to let fall into the enemy's hands. Basically, what it does is, once given a certain signal, the entire weapon will go bang, therefore destroying it and any information it might have imparted upon the enemy's engineers. There are also fairly, classical effects like giving a weapon a fiery edge, or hiding units from view by screwing with the enemy's visions, or hell, just simply making a weapon sharper, or armor tougher, or creating some form of effect once the armor is struck, like, for example, giving the guy who attacks you a nice little shock of electricity, perhaps. There are, in other words, 1,000,001 combinations. Hell, probably even more than that, considering that entire armies used to be equipped with runic armor and weaponry. There were a lot of different combinations, especially, again, considering the fact that the Runesmiths, well, they were kind of dickish, and they often didn't want to share their secrets with anyone, not even with their comrades. Which, well, that's one of the problems and why runic weapons are becoming rarer and rarer and rarer. Now, partially, of course, as mentioned, it's because it's getting harder to make them, just flat out, due to the magic in the Warhammer world, but it's also because that even if a runesmith manages to figure out how to create a really, really powerful and useful rune, there's absolutely no guarantee he's actually going to teach anyone how to create it. Hell, there's not even any guarantee that he's going to teach the person he makes it for how to make it. No, I'm not kidding. As insane as that sounds, runesmiths will occasionally create runic weapons, hand it to people, and not tell them what the weapon will do, because they feel that is somehow disrespecting towards the weapon, like the dwarf is expected to kind of figure it out on his own so that he can properly appreciate it, or hell, maybe they're afraid that some rival might reverse engineer it, who the hell knows? But it did lead to a rather funny little story. So, there is a rune called the Rune of Flight. Now, you might be thinking, okay, does it make the dwarf fly? Well, not really, although it could kind of. What the Rune of Flight actually does is that when you throw the weapon with the rune on it, it's going to fly, like Mjolnir from Thor, and hit people in the face with considerable force. What a lot of people who had this rune inscribed on their weapons were not told was that the Rune of Flight also came with a secondary rune, a homing rune, that returned the weapon to sender. Now, of course, that is really, really useful, and I can see why they would do that, because, well, if you're going to throw away your weapon, it would be nice for it to come back to you, but if you don't tell the poor dwarf that that's what's going to happen, well, I just like to imagine the face on the first dwarf who tried this. He just throws away his hammer because he wants to kill an enemy soldier on the battlefield, and like, oh no, he's going to kill my friend or something. Whoosh. Okay, I saved him. Now, let's just get my secondary weapon, and what's that whistling sound? Poof! Ow. I'm going to kill that runesmith. Hell, it's almost funny enough to convince me that some dwarven runesmiths might actually have a sense of humor. Almost. Not quite enough, though. Finally, let's talk about some general applications. Obviously, they are primarily used for warfare, because, well, most of the runes are offensive in nature, but there are some that is used for everyday things. A rune for heart and home, for example, keeping out unclean influences from minor demonic spirits and such things, which do exist. Now, these things aren't the kind of things that's going to be ripping your throats out, but they do exist, although their power is severely limited. The dwarves are not particularly fond of them. Some runes might simply be used as status symbols, or even to influence the opinions of those nearby. Certain great throne halls, for example, might have a rune carved somewhere on the main throne that causes people to be extra respectful. Mind you, this isn't really something that most dwarves are aware of these days, but we do know that such runes exist. And of course, in older, more affluent days, they used runes for lighting, for cooling down storage areas, or even heating other areas. These days, however, using runes for everyday purposes is very rare, and usually reserved for the very rich, or those who are in possession of very old houses, or, well, houses. areas of a hall to be more precise. An ancient noble family, for example, might have lived in the same area of a karak for thousands of years. And presuming that the runes protecting said holdings have not lost all of their energy, well, they'd still be operating even to this day without any real need for maintenance. In fact, I'm not even sure if it is possible to replenish the energy of a rune. I think I've heard a mention of that somewhere, but I can't for the life of me really figure out whether or not I have. And a quick little Google search, which it's fairly rare for me to have to actually consult Google on this, but I couldn't really find out anything specific, but at the same time, I'm sure I've heard something like that. Though, don't quote me on that, because I am genuinely not sure where the hell I have that from. My brain is just really insistent that I've read it somewhere, so mountain of salt there. Anyways, whether or not I'm off on a complete trip on that, the most popular use for runes these days is weapon and armor, partially because these runes are also a little bit easier to create. Creating something to destroy something else is apparently, relatively speaking, fairly simple. Creating a rune that makes a weapon sharper, for example, relatively simple. Creating a weapon designed specifically to kill a certain target, relatively simple. And again, with relatively simple, I mean ludicrously fucking complex and takes goddamn months, but, well, everything in this world is relative, isn't it? And whilst back in the ancient days, entire armies might be equipped with runic weapons and armor, these days they are far more rare. Generally speaking, you're only going to be finding individual weapons or sets of armor, or maybe an entire set complete with weapons, shields, and armor in the very, very old families. They might have one such extremely prized set of possessions, whilst most families might have one or two runic items which they take extraordinarily good care of. Now, that isn't to say that runic weapons are uncommon, quote-unquote, in modern dwarven armies. There are still quite a few. It's not something completely insane, but double rune weapons or triple rune weapons? That is pretty rare. And that might be for the better, at least balance-wise. There are tales of events during the Great War of Vengeance where dwarves were fired upon by stuff like siege weaponry, like giant ballistas, and the projectiles simply just shattered upon enchanted shields. Or Drake fire simply just washed over regiments of elite infantry without really inflicting any proper damage. Granted, the High Elves had plenty of bullshit magical weaponry of their very own to counter the bullshit weaponry of the dwarves, but nevertheless there was some insane shit in play. I believe there was a part where they used miners to undermine a wall of an elven fortress, and apparently, using enchanted pickaxes, the little bastards could cut their way through solid rock like it was bloody butter. So perhaps it is for the better that a lot of this knowledge has been lost due, at least in part, to the prima donna attitudes of the Runesmiths. I have been quite harsh on the Runesmith through this video, but they really do come across as absolute twats in the books too, where they're just going like, oh yes, this knowledge will die with me because I can't be bothered to teach my apprentices. They're all useless little louts that don't truly appreciate my teachings. But that is of course part of the charms of the dwarves. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.